Hi guys, welcome to Tactic Devs. In this video, we are going to be building an AI chatbot using ASP.NET. Now this chatbot is going to generate an image based on a text prompt, something similar to Midjourney. So before we can begin, let's take a quick look at the tools that we'll be using for this project. So for the code editor, I'll be using VS Code. And to ensure that the development process is smooth, I'll be adding a bunch of extensions. So the first extension I'll be adding is the C# extension, and it provides things like debugging, IntelliSense, etc. The second extension is the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense extension. Now for this project, I'll be styling the UI using Tailwind CSS. So this extension is going to help us by providing IntelliSense as well as code completions. Then the third extension I'll be using is the jQuery code snippets extension. This extension will provide us with some jQuery code snippets for common functions. Alright, so with that being said, let's go to VS Code and get to the coding. Alright, so here in VS Code, before we can set up any project, we first need to set up a folder. So I'll go to the Explorer tab here and I'll select Open Folder. Then here I'll navigate to the Documents folder and I'll add a new folder. I'll name this folder AI Chatbot and I'll simply select this folder. Alright, now that we have a folder for our project, we can then set up an ASP MVC web application project. So to do that, I'm going to run a command in the terminal. So I'll simply open up a new terminal. And I'm going to type in a .NET command. So I'll simply say .NET new MVC. Now to run this command, you need to have the .NET SDK installed on your computer. So before you perform this command, ensure that you have it installed. Otherwise, it won't work. Alright, so here we can see that the SDK created an ASP.NET project in our folder. So let's take a quick look at the project structure. So we have a bunch of folders here and some files. So we have the controllers folder, and this is where we place the controller classes. So right now we have a controller, and this is part of the template. It's called the home controller. In the models folder is where we place our models. The OBJ folder is usually left untempered because this is used during the build process. Properties folder, we can place some properties here in JSON format. Then for our views is where we place our HTML files. But since this is an ASP.NET application, these are CS HTML files. So they actually contain C# code, which is then evaluated and rendered into HTML. All right. Now finally, we have the www root folder, and this is where we place our assets like CSS files, JavaScript files, as well as images. Then finally, we have the program.cs file. Let's quickly open this up. All right, so here in the program.cs file is where we have the code that defines the core of this ASP.NET project. So we have a bunch of code that sets up the application. Then finally, we call the app.run method, which then builds and runs the application. All right, so here we have a method, and this is the map controller route method. So this simply sets the default view that has to be retained when we navigate to the root URL. So in this case, it sets the controller to the home controller, then it sets the action to index. Let's quickly go to the controllers folder here and open up this. So here we have the home controller, and in the home controller we have three methods defined: index, privacy, and error. So basically, when we navigate to this web application's root URL, it's going to return the index view. So this is the action that's going to be executed, and here we can see it returns a view. And by convention, when we name this index, it should look for a view with the name index. So in this case, it'll look for the view inside this views folder, then inside the home folder here. And we can see we have a view named index, and that's what's going to be returned to the client. So in this case, it's going to be this view, which is a simple welcome message. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and run this application. So I'll go to the terminal Then I'll simply clear the terminal and I'll execute the .NET run command. So this is going to start up the application. Alright, so the application is up and running, and we can see that it's listening at this URL, which in this instance, it's the local host. So let's go ahead and open up this link. Alright, so here we can see that our default URL returns to us a view, which is in this case a web page with the message welcome. And this corresponds to the index page. Alright, so let's go back to VS Code. And what I'll do is I'll stop the application and I'll clear the console. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up this project because we have some boilerplate code that we won't be needing. So what I'll do is I'll go to views and I'm going to delete these views because we won't need them. So I'll delete the shared folder. I'll also delete the privacy view. Alright, so in the views folder, I only have one view called index. Then also go to the models folder and I'm going to delete this models class because I won't be needing it. So for this project, I'll only be needing the home controller and the index view. So I'll go to the home controller. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete some actions, like the privacy action as well as the error action. I won't be needing this. Then I'll get rid of this logger object. And also clean up this using statement here. Alright, so I'll go ahead and save this. So the application is going to return the index page as the main page of the application. Now for this project, I'll be using Tailwind CSS to style the front end. So I need to set up Tailwind CSS for this project. And to do that, I'm going to run some Tailwind commands. So the command that I'm going to run is npx tailwind CSS init. So before you run this command, you need to ensure that you have Tailwind installed on your computer. So this command is going to initialize a Tailwind CSS project for our project that we created earlier on. So I'll go ahead and execute the command. Alright, so here in the project, we can see that we now have a new file added, which is tailwind config.js. So we will use this file to further configure Tailwind CSS. So what I'll do here is I'm going to set the content property to a path. So I'll simply add a path. Alright, so what this path does is it tells Tailwind CSS where to look for to find the views, and then Tailwind CSS will look inside those views and see the classes that we use for styling. And once Tailwind knows the classes that are used, it will then generate a CSS file. Let's continue configuring Tailwind CSS. So what I'll do is I'll go to the www root folder, then I'll go to the CSS folder. I'll delete the default CSS file. So what I'll do is I'll create a new file and I'll simply name it input CSS. So Tailwind CSS is going to use this file to determine which classes can be added to our final CSS file. So I'm going to add 3 directives here. So I'll simply say add Tailwind. Then I'll add base. So I'll add the base classes, add Tailwind. Then I'll add the components. Then I'll finally add the utility classes. So that's it for configuring Tailwind CSS. So I'll save these files and I'll simply close them. So at this point, we now need to build Tailwind CSS so that it can generate a CSS file for us that we can then use to style the website. So to do that, I'm going to run a Tailwind CSS command. So first clear the console. Then I'll simply say npx tailwind CSS. Then I'm going to specify an input parameter. So I'll simply say I. Then the input parameter will be simply a path to our input file, which in this case is the input.css. And that is inside the www root folder. Then inside our CSS folder, then the name of the file, which is input.css. Now I also need to specify another path, and the path that I specify next is the output path. And this is where Tailwind CSS is going to store the generated CSS file. So I'll simply set the output parameter. So I'll say O. This will also be in the root folder. Then in the CSS folder, then the name of this file will be app.css. All right, so let's go ahead and run this command. And when the command executes, we should see a new file included in the CSS folder here. All right, so here we have the app.css file generated. Let's go ahead and open it up. And here we can see a bunch of styles defined in this file. But one thing is that we haven't defined much of the styling here. We only have one class, which is the text center. So when we add more classes here, we are going to need to rebuild this so that Tailwind CSS will give us a fresh copy of the app.css file with the new styles included. So this means every time we make edits to the front end, we always need to build Tailwind CSS. But I don't want to be building Tailwind CSS every time. So I would like to automate this process. And to automate this process, I can do that by simply executing this command every time I build my ASP.NET application. And ASP.NET allows us to do that. So to do that, we simply go to the apps project file here, and we can do that by adding a target tag. So I'll simply say target. And I'll set a name property for this target. I'll set it to build CSS. Then I'll set another property called before targets. And I'll set this property to compile. So before compiling, I would like to execute a command. Now here I'm going to add a new tag, and this is the execute tag. And I'll specify the command property here. So the command is this very command that we executed earlier on. So I'll simply go here and copy this command. And then I'll paste it here. All right. Now finally, I'm going to add another property, and this is the condition property. So this property is going to define when it's valid to execute this command. So that will be set to when the configuration is set to debug, we can execute the command. All right, so that's basically how we are going to build the Tailwind CSS file. Okay, so by doing this, whenever we build our application, it's also going to build the CSS file so that we don't have to manually build it. So that should do it. So I'll go ahead and save this, and I'll come here and clear the console. So let's go to the index page. So this is the main view that's going to hold the UI for our application. So I'll start by deleting all the code that's here. Then I'm going to add an HTML tag. Now inside this body tag, I'm going to add some code which is going to define the UI. But before I do that, I need to specify a link here to the CSS file. So simply set this to the CSS folder, then the app.css file. Now I can type the UI manually, but I do not want to do that because it's going to be time consuming. So what I'm going to do is I'll simply go to a website called prerequisites.com, and I'm going to get a template from there and then simply paste the HTML code here. So let's go to the browser. So here in the browser, I'll simply type in prerequisites.co. All right, so here we have prerequisites.com, and Prerequisites offers a bunch of Tailwind CSS HTML templates as well as components. So what we want to do here is we want to scroll down to where it says starter pages and examples. So we can then click view examples. So here on the application AI prompt page, we have a bunch of templates defined. So we have one called classic, which has a simple UI of a conversation list as well as a text input area. You can scroll down. We have another one called chat, and this one is similar to the first one. The difference is only that the conversation is placed at the left as well as at the right. Let's scroll down. I kind of like this one because it has a sidebar. So if we try dark mode, we can see this is what we have here. This is pretty good. So what I'll do is I'll actually copy this template. So here, let's look at the HTML code, and we can see that the styling here is Tailwind CSS styling. So I'll simply copy this HTML by clicking copy here. All right, so let's go back to VS Code. So here in VS Code, I'll simply paste the code that I copied. All right, so here we have the code. So what I'll do is I'll save this file and run the application. Now, since we know that the default page is the index page, so we should be able to see an AI chat application like UI. So I'll come here and then I'll type in .NET run to start the application. So here it says we have an error, and this error is defined on our projects file, and it says target start tag does not match the end tag. All right, so let's go to this file here, and we actually made a mistake. We placed this slash here and we were supposed to place it here. All right, so I'll go ahead and save this, and I'll simply clear the console and run the application. All right, so the application is up and running, and we can simply click this link here. All right, so here we can see that the application is running smooth and we have the UI as we intended. Now we know that this is coming from our application because the URL is set to localhost. I can refresh this and we still get the same page. So what I'll do is I'll delete most of this conversation except this first item here. And I'm also going to delete these items in this list except this one that says new chat. So let's go back to VS Code. So what I'll do is I'll stop the application from running. Then I'll clear the console. So let's go to the index page. So here in the index page, the good thing is that the template that we used has got comments. So we can easily find the sections that we want to remove. So here we have the sidebar section. Let's scroll down, and in the sidebar section we have where it says list. So this should be the list in our sidebar, and we have a bunch of list items. So this one indicates new chat. We're going to leave this as is, so we're going to delete the rest of the list items. So I'll simply collapse this item, then the next one. All right, so these items have been collapsed. We do not need them, so I'll go ahead and delete them. All right, now after this, let's continue scrolling down. So here we have the content section, and this contains the conversation. Let's continue scrolling down. All right, so this should be our conversation list. So we have an unordered list tag here, and inside this, we have a bunch of items. So they are named chat bubble. So I'll collapse the first item. All right, so we can see we have the first item here, then the second one is here. So I'm going to delete everything else except the first item. So what I'll do is I'll simply copy the first item as well as the opening tag of our unordered list. So I'll simply copy this. Now that I have it copied to the clipboard, I'll collapse the whole list. Now notice that we have over 1000 lines of code here because most of the code is contained within this conversation. So I'll go ahead and delete the entire list. Then what I'll do is I'll then paste the list with only the first item. All right, so here we have the list here. Then we have our item here. So inside this item, I'll delete this text here, and I'll simply first add a closing tag to our unordered list. All right. Okay, now that I have that tag, I'll simply delete these text items here. I do not need them. So I'll collapse this div and I'll get rid of this div. So in my list item, the only thing that I have is a logo as well as some h2 text, which is defined here. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'll delete part of this logo by deleting this path. All right. So we should see a simple logo. The other thing that I'm going to delete is the message, which is the welcome message here. In fact, I won't delete it. I'll simply modify it. So it says, welcome to Preline AI. I'll simply change this to welcome to Tactic Devs AI. All right, so that should do it. So I'll go ahead and save this, and then I'll run the application. So I'll say .NET run. All right, so the application is up and running. We can navigate to the URL. All right, so here we see we now have our application, and we can see that the logo has changed, the conversation is gone, and here we have only one item here. So I'll delete this other tab. In fact, if we view this other tab, this is how it looked before, then this is how it looks now. But if I refresh this page, we are going to have the new view. So this is what we have. This is the new stuff. So I'll go ahead and close this. So let's go back to VS Code. Now at this point, we have the application set up, at least the base application set up. Now we need to integrate this application with an API, and that API is going to provide us with the images that we need. So let's do this by going to Google Chrome. Now there are a bunch of APIs that we can use, but there's one that I have in mind, and it's called Segmind. So let's go to segmind.com. All right, so here we have segmind.com opened up, and segmind.com provides some generative models, and we can call their APIs for different models. So we have the age of realism, realistic vision, stable diffusion, etc. So let's go ahead and explore stable diffusion. All right, so here we have a playground, and it allows us to type in some prompts and then generate images here. But what we're interested in is the API right here. So we're going to be calling this API. So this is the documentation for the API, and this is what we need to make an API call. And here the URL is specified for the specific model, which is stable diffusion, and it has a request payload. So this is the data that we need to send to the server to make a request. And it contains the prompt property, the negative prompt property as well. Then for the response, what we get is an image of the type JPEG. All right, so this should do it for our API. Let's go to the console. All right, so here in the console, we can create new API keys, and let's go to the usage tab here. So Segmind gives us free credits that we can use to make API calls. So right now I have 91 credits left. All right, so we are going to use this API to generate the images. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. So here I'm going to stop the application and I'll clear the console. Now at this point, I'm going to write some code that's going to make the API calls. So to do that, I'm going to create a service class. So I'm simply going to place my class inside the models folder here. So I'm going to create a new class. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in a command here. So I'm going to open up a new terminal. So in my new terminal, I'm going to change the directory and I'll change it to the models folder. Alright, so now that I'm in the models folder, I'm going to type in the .NET new command. So this time I'll specify that I want to create a new class. So .NET new class. Then I'll also indicate the name of the class. So in this case, I'll name the class prompt service. And I'll go ahead and execute this command. Alright, so the class was created successfully. So here in the models folder, we have the prompt service class. Now you can add this class manually right here from the editor, but I'd like to do it using the command. This way I can have the namespace included in the class. Alright, now that I have the class here, I'm going to close this terminal that I created. So I'll simply delete that. Alright, so we are back to our project's terminal here. So here in the class, I'm going to create a method. So this method will be a public method. So it's a public and it will be static. And this method is going to return, it will be async and it's going to return a task. And this task is going to return a type here. So I'm going to indicate this later on, right? Now I'll name this method getImage and it's going to call the API and it's going to take in a string and this string is going to be our prompt. So I'll name it prompt. Alright, so to make an HTTP request, we need to make use of the HTTP client class that's defined in .NET. So I'll simply use a using statement. So what the using statement does, it ensures that once we are done using the client class, we dispose of all its resources. So I'll simply define here HTTP client. Then I'll create a variable, I'll name it client. Set it to a new instance of the HTTP client class. All right. Now that we have our client here, we can now make the call to the API. So to make a call to the API, we need to add some data. And to do that, we need an HTTP request message. So I'm going to create that object here. So I'll simply say HTTP request message. Then I'll name it request message. I'll set it to a new instance. So here in the constructor, we can add two parameters. So we need to add the type of method. So in this case, it's a post method. We're creating a post method. So I'll say HTTP, and I'll say method. Then I'll set it to post. The next argument will be the URL. In this case, to our model. So I'll simply do that by adding a new object of the type URI. Then inside this URI object, in the constructor, I'm going to set the URL, which will be some text. So the URL is defined on the Segmind website. So let's go back to Google Chrome. So here on the Segmind website, if we look at the API, and for this stable diffusion model, the URL is indicated here. So I'll simply copy this URL. Then let's go back to VS Code. So here in VS Code, I'll simply specify the URL here. All right, so we have our request message. So we specify the method, which is a post, and the URL, but we still need to configure this. So we need to add some data, which is our request payload. And we can do that by setting the content of this request message. So simply set the content here. We need to set the content to a JSON object, which is defined at segmind.com. Let's go back. So here at segmind.com, we have the payload defined here, which is data, contains the prompt and other stuff. So what I'll do is I'll copy this JSON object and go back to VS Code. So here in VS Code, what I'll do is I'll paste this object here. Now, because this is JSON, C# won't understand this syntax. So we need to edit this so that it becomes an ordinary object. So what I'll do is I'll add the keyword variable. And what I'll do is I'll also get rid of these quotes here. So I'll select this text here. And what I'll do is I'm going to replace these quotes. So I'll replace the quotes with nothing. So do that. Then I'll also replace the colon with the equal sign. All right, so with that being done, do the same for the prompt. Set this to an equal sign, this to an equal sign as well. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to define this object as an anonymous object. I'm not going to define this object as a type, as a class. So I'll simply define it as an anonymous object. So to do that, I'll just add the new keyword here, and I won't specify the type. So I'll simply say new. All right, we can see that C# is now recognizing this object. So here, I'll change this to be text. So I'll add the quotes, I'll add them back. This will also be text. Yes will also be text. Then this will be a boolean, but we just need to change this to lowercase. All right, so that makes it back to a boolean. I'll add a semicolon here. All right, so now this is a valid object that is recognized in C#. Let me just do a bit of formatting there. All right, so we now have this object, and it's of the type anonymous. It's not defined. It's an anonymous type, but it contains all the properties that we need here. So for the prompt, I'm not going to hard code this prompt here. So I'll simply get rid of the prompt. So the prompt will be set to whatever text we pass through the getImage method here. So I'll copy this and I'll set it to that. All right, I'll leave the negative prompt as is. Now that we have our data here inside an object, we can then set the request message content to that object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to a JSON content. So I'll simply say JSON content. Then the JSON content class has a method called create. So this method is going to create a content type based on the object that we pass it. So I'll pass it the data object. All right, so this method will help us format this into JSON so that it can be sent with the API call. Now the next step is to define an API key, right? Because we need a key to access that API. So let's go back to Segmind. All right, here, how do we define our API key? So here it tells us we need to add it to the headers, right? So we specify this X API key, then we add our API. So we need to add it to the headers. All right, so let me go to the console. All right, so here in the console, I have an API key, and apparently it's expired because I only set it to 1 day. So let's create a new API key. And here I'm going to also set it to 1 day. So this should last for 1 day. All right, we now have an API key. So I'll go ahead and copy this key, and let's go back to VS Code. All right, so here in VS Code, to add some headers to the request message, I'll simply say request message, then I'll say headers, then I'll say add. So the add method takes in two arguments, and they're both strings, one to indicate the key and one to indicate the value. So our key is equal to X API key. All right. Then the next one will indicate our API key. So I'll simply paste here. So at this point, we now have the data that we need to make the API call. To make the API call, we now use the client class. So earlier on, I created a variable here called client. So I'll simply use this variable. I'll say client. Then I'll use the method that is the send async. So send a request. And here I'll indicate the message. So the message is our request message. So simply paste that there. And that's it. Now this is an async, so we need to await it. So I'll simply say await. Now after we await it, we want to return this. So I'll simply return it as well. Now what we're returning from this is an HTTP response message. So we are using a request message to send a request, but what we get back is a response message. So here in the method, let me delete this white space here. So here in the method, we need to indicate which type of object we are returning. So in this case, it's an HTTP response message. All right, so that should do it. So let me clean up this. All right, so let's have a quick recap. So we have a method called getImage. We pass in a prompt. Then we create an HTTP client class. We also define some data here that we need to make the API call. Then here we create a request message. We indicate the type of method, which is a post, and the URL. Then we convert this data into JSON and add it to the request message. We also add our API key to the header. Then finally, we send our request. So we should expect a response, and that response will be inside an object called HTTP response message. All right, so this method does that for us. So let's go to the home controller. So the home controller is simply the controller that's going to handle requests that are made to certain URLs to our application, to our saver. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to add another action. So I'll simply copy the index action here and I'll paste. So I'll name this action prompt. All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a route attribute for this action. So simply say route, and I'll specify a URL. So it's a root URL, then followed by the word prompt. So when I specify a route here, I'm simply specifying a URL that I can type in the browser to execute this action. And then the action is going to return something here. In this case, it's a view. So I'm simply indicating that here. All right, so what I want to do inside this action is I want to use the method that I created earlier on, which is inside our prompt service class. So I'll say prompt service, and it's a static method called getImage. And here I'm going to indicate the prompt that I want. And in this case, what I'm simply going to type in is a puppy eating cookies. So this will be the prompt that will be sent to the server. For now, we are going to hard code it here. So this is going to return a response message. So I'll save that inside a variable. So I'll simply say response is equal to what we get here. This method is async, so we can await it. So I'll simply say await. So for us to await this has to be an async method as well. And we also have to return a task. So we need to add task here, right? So this action will be inside a task. All right, so that makes our code valid. So once I have this response, I would like to then show it to the user inside the conversation list. But for now, we first need to test if the API is working. So what I'll do here is I'm going to return a file. So I'll simply say file. And to return a file, I need to specify the bytes as well as the type of file I'm sending. So what I'll do is I'll simply convert this response into bytes. Now we understand that the response that's coming from the server is an image. So we know that we have an image. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'll simply say response, then content, then I'll read as, say, read as a byte array. Now this is async, so I can await it. So right here in the method, I'm going to await it. So I'll simply say await. All right, now that I have my bytes defined here, I now need to define what type of file is inside these bytes. So that is done by simply specifying a string here. And the string should contain the word image and / and the extension of that image, so or the kind of that image, which is a JPEG image. All right, JPEG image. So this file will now return, this method file will return a file to the browser. So the browser is just going to display an image. So this time we are not returning a view, we're actually returning a file. And what we're going to do here is we'll simply run our application, then we're going to navigate to this URL, which is our root URL, then / prompt. So that is going to initiate this action. Then after it processes everything here, it's going to return a file to us. So we should be able to see an image. Then that means we are calling the API. All right. Now, one other thing I need to do is I need to also make this call or this prompt action into an HTTP GET action. So this means I can actually write this inside the browser's URL section, and it will respond. But by default, it's already set to this, but I would just like to explicitly set it to this. All right, so with that being said, I'll go ahead and save this and go to the console here. Then I'll simply run the application. I'll say .NET run. All right, so the application is up and running. Let's navigate to the link. So here by default, we still see the normal UI. But what we want to do is we want to make the API call. So to do that, I'll go here to our root URL, but this time I'm going to add a / prompt. And that's going to initiate the API call. Then we should expect to get an image. Then that means our API is being called and we are getting an image back. All right, so here we can now see that we have an image of a puppy eating cookies, just like we specified in the prompt. So that means our API call is working very well. And notice here we have an image and its dimensions are 1024 by 1024. And that's because we indicated this in the data that was sent during the API call. Now at this point, we do not want the user to interact with our application in this manner. What we want is when the user simply types the prompt here, then we have the image returned here in the conversation list. All All right, so to do this, what I'm going to do is I'll simply go back to VS Code. Now, one thing is that I would like to fix this thing here. And you see we have our text area here in the center. I would like to ensure that this is at the bottom here. So I'm also going to fix that during the process. So I'll close this. Let's go back to VS Code. So here in VS Code, I'm going to stop the application and I'll simply clear the console. All right, so to fix the problem of the UI, let's go to the index view here. And here in the index view, we have our section, which is the content section. And the content section contains the input area. So we should see another section here named input. All right, so this is our input area here. So the input area is inside what we call the footer tag. And this is what we see here. So if we look at the footer tag, the position is set to sticky. So by looking at this class, sticky, and the bottom property is set to 0. So this indicates that the footer tag should always try to be at the bottom of its parent. So it's always trying to be at the bottom of its parent, but unfortunately, its parent's height is not sufficient enough. So it means its parent height is not set to the full width of the viewport. So let's navigate and look for its parent. So let's go up here, and its parent should be the content container here. However, this div has its height set to 100 VH, which means this is already set to full, which means it fills the height of the viewport. So I should believe that this div is the parent to the footer. So what I'm going to do is I'll simply set the minimum height. So the minimum height of the parent should be set to the height of the viewport. So that would be the minimum height of that parent. It shouldn't go less than that. Right, so I'll go ahead and save this. So that should fix the problem. Now, the next step is to configure this application in such a way that we interact with the UI and then we have the image sent back. So let's go back to the home controller here. So what I'm going to do here in the home controller, instead of returning a file, I'm going to return a view. But this time, the type of view I'm going to return is a partial view. So a partial view is simply a tiny portion of HTML code. Then once I get that tiny portion of HTML code, I can now send it to the application through an AJAX call, and then I can insert it inside the conversation list. So instead of returning a file, I'll simply return a partial view. So inside this partial view, I'll get rid of this. So the partial view that will be returned, I need to create this partial view. So let's go to our views folder here, then we go to home, then let's create a new view. So what I'll do is I'll simply copy the old one, which is our index view, then I'll paste. And I'll give it a name. I'll simply rename it to message response. All right. So this is our partial view. So what I'll do inside this partial view is I'll delete everything that we see here. So let's go to the home controller. So here in the home controller, I can now specify the name of the partial view that I would like to return. So by simply specifying that as a string, so I'll simply type in message response. So that should return the partial view that we just created. All right, so the other thing is I can also pass in some data to the view, then process that data and then render the final HTML, then return it as a partial view. So to do that, I'll simply indicate that I would like to pass data to the view. So I'll add this response object and pass it down to the view. Right, so there we have it. So I'll then go back to the message response partial view here. So here I'll indicate the type of object I would be expecting to receive from the controller. And I'll do that by specifying the add model directive. So I'll say add model Then I'll specify the type that I'll be expecting. So HTTP response message. So what I'll do is I'll then add some more C# code. So I'll create a variable. I'll name this variable image, and image will be equal to the content of the response message that we get. So to access that object, I'll simply use the model keyword, and model contains a property called content, and content contains a method called read as bytes async. So I'll call this method, then it's going to return the bytes of that image. Now I do not want to store these as bytes. What I want to store is I would like to store them as a base 64 string. So I'll change this name to image base 64. Then what I'll do is I'll convert this array of bytes into base 64, and to do that I'll simply use the convert class. So I'll say convert, then I'll call the to base 64 string, and I'll simply pass it the array of bytes that we get. Now since this is async, we can await it. So I'll simply say await. Alright, so that is it. So at this point we now have our image formatted as base 64. Now here what I want to do is I'll add in some HTML code that is going to be sent back as the partial view. So let's go to the index view here, and let's scroll down to our content section. So inside the content section we have our list, which is our conversation list. So what I'll do is I'll copy this list item here, because I want my response message to resemble a list item from the conversation. So I'll simply copy this, then go to the message response. So I'll paste this. So I would like to return this list item. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an if statement. So I'm going to say add, I'll say if this response message, which is the object that we got, which is saved inside a property called model. So if model is success status code, meaning the request was successful, then we should return this HTML code. So I'll simply paste it here. So this is the code that we want to return, and when we receive this code, we're going to add it to the list of the conversation. But what we want to do here is we do not want to return a message here. We would like to return an image. So what I'll do is I'll simply get rid of this tag, and what I'm going to do is I'll simply add in an image tag, and this image tag contains a property called source. So I'll specify the source, then I'll also add a class. So the class is going to indicate the height and the width of the image. Now our API call, if we look at the prompt service class, describes the height of 1024 and 1024. That's too much. We can't render this size in the UI. So what we do is here we're going to resize that. So I'll simply say height will be set to 80. So this is a Tailwind CSS class, which is going to set the height to 320 pixels. So we do the same for the width. So width dash 80. All right. Then we also want our image to have rounded corners. So what I'm going to do is I'll simply use the rounded class, and I'll say rounded medium. So that is going to ensure that our border has a radius of 6 pixels. All right. So here we are expecting to return this HTML code with an image. But how do we define the source of this image? So here we have the base 64 string of our image. We can actually insert it as the source. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another string, so I'll simply say variable, then I'll say image source is equal to a string. And to create an image source that contains base 64 data, we need to simply follow a specific pattern. So we say data, then we add a colon, then we say image, then the type of image, which is a JPEG in this case, so we say JPEG, then we add a semicolon. Then here we indicate the format, which in this case is base 64, so we say base 64. Then we are going to add our base 64 string right after the comma. So to add that string here, we simply get this variable here and place it here. But we need to use string interpolation. So I'll add the $, then some curly braces. Then I'll get this string and add it to my source string. So this is going to return a string with base 64 image data. So I'll then take this string and set it to the source of the image here. So I'll use the @ symbol. Alright, so this will be the source of our image. Right. Now suppose if the status code was not successful, what do we do? So add an else statement. Then in the else statement, I'm going to return an item similar to this one, but this item will not contain an image, so I'll get rid of this image and I'll add in an h2 tag. I need to say something went wrong. Alright, so that should do it. Alright, so let's have a quick recap of this partial view. So we pass in data to the partial view, we process this data by extracting the image and we convert it to base 64. We create a string, then we add some HTML code here with an image, then we add that string to the source of the image. So this is going to return HTML with an image. We add a few classes here, then we also add another HTML portion which will be returned if at all the status of that response message was error. Alright, so there we have it. I'll go ahead and save this. Let's go back to the controller. Alright, so here in the controller, when the prompt request is made, we expect to receive a partial view. So let's make some few changes here. So I'll change this from HTTP GET to HTTP POST. So this means we can no longer access this in the browser's link area. Then here, I do not want to have a hard-coded prompt, so I'll get rid of this prompt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask that the user pass in an object. So here, I'm going to simply say prompt object. So simply say obj. So prompt object should be passed. And this prompt object will be given a name. And the name will be just obj. Alright, so prompt object has a name called obj. Then we get obj and we extract the prompt text from obj. So we say prompt text. But apparently obj is not any class type. So we need to generate a class. So to do that, I'll simply go to quick fix here. It will suggest that I generate a class. So I'll generate a class. And here we see we have a new class here. So this class should contain a property which will have the name prompt text, right? So here I'll add a property. So I'll say property. And the property will be of the type string, a nullable type of string. Then it will have a name called prompt text. right? So we need this type so that ASP.NET can easily map the data that will be coming in when we make this prompt call. All right, so this is set up, right? So I'll go ahead and save this. Now let's go to the index view here. So the index view is housing our app. So what this means is that when we open up our website, we are going to see a conversation, and what we want to do is we want to type in some text, then send, then receive an image. So we need to add some JavaScript code. So let's go to the root here, then here in the JavaScript folder, we're going to change this. I'll change its name to app.js. Then I'll delete everything here, all the comments that we see here. Then I'll add in a function. So the function's name is going to be called prompt AI. And this will not take any parameters. All right, so this prompt AI is what's going to send the prompt text to the server in the background, and then it's going to get an image back, which is a partial view. Then it's going to add it to the list. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'll go to the index view here, and in the index view, I'm going to add some IDs here. So I would like to add an ID to the list of the conversation, which is what we have here, an ordered list. So add an ID. So I'll say ID, and I'll name this chat list. So I'll give this an ID of chat list. All right, so we have chat list. Then I'll go to the input area here, and we see we have a tag called text area. I'll change this to an input type. Make sure the closing tag is also set to input. All right, so I'll give this an ID as well. So I'll say ID, and I'll give it a name input, or I'll name it prompt input. Prompt input. All right, now that we have some IDs set here, like prompt input and chat list, it means we can now access these DOM elements in our JavaScript file. So let's go back to our JavaScript file here. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable, and I'll name this variable prompt input, which will be set to the document get element by ID. So I'll get that element by specifying its ID. So that's our input. Then I'll also get the other element, which is the chat list. Now that we have the two elements, it means we can get the text that the user is going to input, and we can now insert the new response into the list here. So to do that, we are going to make an API call, an AJAX call rather. So I'll say jQuery AJAX. All right, so here we are making an AJAX call, which is a background call to our server. Now our server contains an action, and this action is the prompt action, which returns a partial view, right? And its URL is set to prompt here. So here in our app.json file, we can indicate that we'll find this action at this URL. So the URL is the prompt URL, and the type of data that we're expecting to receive is HTML. I'll get rid of this data property here. We won't need that. And the method of this action that we are going to be calling, or this URL, is a post method. So I'll indicate that as well. So it's post. Now we also need to execute something when this comes back. So when we have the response, which is an HTML file, we now need to do something with that response. So what we are going to do with the response is we are simply going to add it to the list. So I'll simply say chat list, then I'll say the inner HTML. We should append whatever we get from this core here. So to append, I'll simply say plus equals, then our response. So this simply means append whatever you get back here. And we know what we're getting back is this partial view here. We're getting back this partial view, which is either this item or this item. And that is being done because we are calling the prompt, which is set at this URL, to return this partial view. So here, our JavaScript is doing this for us. Now, the other thing that I would like to do is that I would like to call this method when the user clicks the send button. So let's go back to our index view. And here, let's look for the send button. So in our toolbar here, let's scroll down. And here is our send button. All right. So our send button should have an event, which is the onClick event. And then the onClick event should call the prompt AI method here. So let's copy this. Copy. Then we should call this. All right. Now this method is defined inside our app.js file. So to call this inside the view, we need to add a script tag here at the bottom. All right. So let's go ahead and add a script tag. And we need to indicate where this script is. In this case, it's inside our JS. Then it's app.js. Now remember that this app.js is also calling jQuery. If we look at this, this $sign indicates that this is jQuery. So we also need to have jQuery inserted here. And if we look at our root folder here, we have a folder called lib, and this was added by ASP.NET when we created the template. And luckily, it also included jQuery. So we can actually access the jQuery file here. So what I'll do is I'll simply copy this and indicate jQuery's location. So in this case, it's located in our lib folder. Then inside our lib folder is another folder called jQuery. And inside the jQuery folder is something called distribution, which is our distribution folder. And the name of the file is called jQuery.js. So simply say jQuery.js. So that should do it. So this adds jQuery to our application so that we can now call the Ajax method. All right, so with that being done, I'll go ahead and save this. I'll also save my app file here. Now, one thing is this: every time I click the send button, this method is going to be called. But I would like to do something. I would like to get the message, and I would like to get the prompt rather, and then send the prompt to the saver. So to send the prompt, we need to indicate some data here. So simply say data, and this data will be set to an object. So the object will contain a property, and the property is called prompt text. And this prompt text will be set to the prompt input. So we'll get the value from the prompt input. So it's a value. All right, so that the value, so which means whatever text we type in the input will be set to this prompt text property. And why do we give this name? Why do we name it prompt text? The reason we name it prompt text because our controller here will be expecting an object. And this object has got a property called prompt text. So we need to ensure that the spelling of this prompt text is the same as the object that we send when making the Ajax call. So that's the reason we have the name prompt text. All right, so here we name it prompt text. So we send that data. Now, the other thing is that when the user clicks the send button, we need to add whatever text we send to the conversation list. So we add the text to the conversation list, then we get the response. So to add the text to the conversation list, what we need to do is we need to get our chat list here. So before we make the Ajax call, then we get the inner HTML. Then our inner HTML, we're going to add some text. And that text is going to indicate the prompt that we made. So we can now get this prompt value, then add it to the list. But in this case, it's just going to add it as a string. We would like to add some styling as well as have it appear as though it's an item inside the list. So to do that, we go to our partial view here. And what I'll do is I'll simply copy this and go to our JavaScript file here. So I would like to add this inside that HTML content. So what I'll do is I'll change this HTML content into some text. So I'm going to do this by adding some colons, some quotes rather. So single quote, and all right. So what this will do is it changes this into a string. All right. Now inside here, instead of sending the word something went wrong, we're now going to get the value of the prompt input. So I'll say prompt input, then get the value. So add this value to this HTML code, then add it to the inner HTML. So this will ensure that every time we click the send button, we first add our text to the conversation. Then once the response comes back, it's added here. All right, so that should do it. So I'll go ahead and save this. Now at this point, let's run the application. So I'll say .NET run. All right, so we can see that the application is up and running. So let's go ahead and try to type in a prompt. So I'll simply say monkey eating cookies, or eating a cookie. Right, so monkey eating cookie. Let's go ahead and send this. And we can see that our text is added to the conversation list. So we should expect an image here, but it takes time to make an API call. And because the image has to be generated on the API side. So let's wait for a few seconds. All right, so there we have it. We have an image of a monkey eating a cookie. Let's try to type in something else. Let's say cat smiling. Let's send the prompt and wait a few seconds. All right, so there we have it. We have our image here of a cat smiling. Not a perfect image, but at least we see that the AI chatbot is responding. All right, so that's how you go about it. So what we can do here is we can change other parameters when we make the API call that would change the output of the image. So we can do that by allowing the user to maybe adjust the seed, etc, etc. So thanks guys for watching this video. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you find this content useful. So I'll be adding the source code to this project in the video description. Thanks for watching, happy coding, and I'll see you in the next one.